On the outskirts of a secluded village, hidden by a winding path among dense trees, stood an old colonial house, marked by time. Its walls, once white and imposing, were now covered with moss, and the windows, before bright, were dusty and broken. The roof collapsed in some places, and the wooden fence surrounding the ground seemed to crumble with each strong wind that passed. The house had been abandoned for decades, but to the residents of the nearby village it was never truly empty. When the full moon illuminated the sky, a faint, almost magical light seemed to emanate from inside the house. Sometimes the villagers would swear to hear laughter from children echoing through the cold night, childish laughter that seemed to play with the wind. Others claimed to see shadows moving through the windows, small figures dancing and hiding, as if they were playing in the dark rooms of the house. These stories, passed from generation to generation, were the food of superstitions that permeated the village. There were those who believed that the laughter and shadows were only echoes of the past, but others were not so sure. The old story of the mysterious disappearance of children in the region was still told, a puzzle that no one could solve. The disappearances had occurred many decades before, and the house, with its now crumbling walls, was always at the center of these stories. Some said that the spirits of the children were still trapped there, tormented by what had happened. But for two brothers, the idea that the house was haunted was a pure fantasy. James and Lily, both teenage and naturally skeptical, grew up listening to the stories told by older people. While others avoided the house, afraid of what the locals called house shadow, James and Lily saw it as just another rural legend, designed to scare the little ones. For them, nothing there was more than superstition, a psychological trick of the minds weakened by loneliness and fear of the unknown. Tired of hearing the rumors, they decided to spend a night inside the house. They wanted to prove to themselves that the stories were only inventions, that the villagers were bound by myths and unfounded fears. "Let's go and end this story once and for all," said James with a defiant smile. Lily, though reluctant, accepted the challenge. She wanted to believe that her brother was right, but something about the idea of spending the night in such a remote place still bothered her. On the eve of the full moon, armed with lanterns and backpacks, the two began to walk along the path that led to the house. The trail was narrow and covered with dry leaves, and the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the dense vegetation around. The wind blew through the trees, creating a hissing murmur that seemed to follow them as they advanced. Lily felt a shiver in her spine with every step, but tried to disguise it, convincing herself that it was just the wind or her own anxiety. When they arrived at the house, the scenery was even darker than they had imagined. The old structure seemed to give off a feeling of discomfort, as if the air around it was denser. James, however, was excited. "None of this will scare me," he said, looking at the house with a defiant expression. He pushed the wooden door, which opened with a squeaky creak, and the two entered the house, where the air was heavy and stagnant. The interior of the house was covered with dust and darkness. The walls were covered with time marks, and the wooden floor cracked under their feet. They began to explore the place, lighting lanterns. Nothing looked very different from what they had imagined. Old and dusty furniture, broken toys in the corner, and the strong smell of mold. But something was strangely quiet. There were no sounds of animals, nothing to interrupt the silence that surrounded the house. As the minutes passed, the environment seemed to become more oppressive, more dense. The laughter that the villagers had heard was distant, but the shadows dancing on the walls, instead of reassuring them, began to make the air heavier. James laughed, mocking his sister's fear. "Nothing much, Lily. just a bunch of junk and nonsense legends. But Lily couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was watching them there, in the shadows of the house. The next morning, the village seemed as quiet as ever. But for James and Lily, there was something different in the air. The sun was stronger that day, but the feeling of an invisible weight hovered over them. They had already convinced themselves that nothing supernatural would happen that night. But as the full moon approached, a feeling of restlessness began to take hold of Lily. She tried to ignore the whispers in her mind, telling herself that it would be just another ordinary night, that all of that was just a legend. James, however, was excited by the prospect of proving that all this was an invention of superstitious minds. He took the backpacks and put in the essentials: lanterns, water bottles, and some food. "Let's put an end to these stories once and for all," he said, with a determined expression. Lily, although skeptical, still could not get out of her head the discomfort she felt about the house. She knew it would be difficult to go there and spend the night, but because of her brother, she decided to face her fear. As night approached, the atmosphere in the village seemed to change. The clear day sky began to darken rapidly, and the wind, which had been calm until then, began to blow more strongly, as if nature itself was preparing for something. "Do you see? The full moon is coming, and it's just going to be another normal night," said James, trying to cheer up Lily as they both started walking down the trail. The trail leading to the house seemed to have gained a different quality as they moved away from the village. The trees around were more closed, and the vegetation was denser, as if he wanted to swallow the path. The sound of their footsteps on the dry-leaf ground was muffled, and the wind intensified, causing the branches of the trees to swing, creating a hissing sound that seemed to come from all directions. Lily felt watched, as if something was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to act. She said nothing, but her mind was full of questions. As they moved forward, James kept on holding a challenging pose, fiddling with his phone to record videos. "Let's get those pictures, Lily. Then everyone will see that the house is just a pile of stones and wood," he said, trying to ease the tense mood she felt. Lily did not respond, but her mind was far away, lost in the murmurs of the wind and the movement of shadows around. The trail seemed longer and more isolated, as if they were moving away from everything they knew. Finally, when the moonlight began to shine brightly, they came home. The sight was even more terrifying at night. The windows were wide open, as if they were waiting for them. The wooden door that James had pushed earlier was slightly open, cracked again when he touched it. The house, now shrouded in the dusk, looked more like a sinister figure than a simple old building. Lily hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of darkness around her. She could feel her heart beating stronger, and a feeling of cold enveloped her, even with the stuffy air. "I don't know, James. Something is not right here," she said, her voice lower than intended. James just smiled and walked into the house without hesitation. "Stop for freshness. I told you there's nothing here." With a last sigh, Lily followed her brother into the house. As they stepped on the wooden floor, a shrill sound echoed through the room. It was the sound of something breaking in the shadows, but they couldn't identify what it was. James looked around with a victorious smile. "See? Nothing too much." However, the air was dense, heavy in a way they could not explain. The walls seemed to emit an energy that infiltrated the background of their thoughts, as if the house itself was alive and watching them. They advanced to the entrance hall, where the sound of their footsteps echoed in a peculiar way. James's lantern lit the way, but the shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, dancing to the rhythm of the wind that came through the broken windows. The laughter that the villagers mentioned began to seep into their ears, but at first the two tried to ignore it. "They are only echoes of the wind," said James, but his smile wavered. Lily, however, couldn't get rid of the growing feeling of discomfort. Something was wrong there, something that could not be explained. The wind was blowing stronger now, and the house seemed to respond, with the doors creaking and the furniture moving slightly, as if they were preparing to receive the brothers. They were inside, but the world outside seemed to have disappeared, as if the house had swallowed them up completely. With the air heavier, a feeling of claustrophobia began to spread. Lily felt she could not leave, as if something was holding her there, waiting for her to realize what was about to happen. The house seemed to breathe. Each would snap. Each rustle of dried leaves against the ground sounded more like a deep sigh coming from the bowels of the building. James and Lily's lanterns slowly lit up the corridors, but the shadows seemed to move at their own pace, distant and dark. It was as if the house had life, as if it were a silent witness to something much older than anyone could imagine. "See, there's nothing here," James said, trying to divert his sister's attention, but his voice sounded forced. There was something in his expression, something he could not hide. The smile that once seemed confident now was beginning to fade. He looked around, looking at the walls with his eyes more fixed. "We are just seeing things." But Lily, with her eyes wide open, was no longer so sure. She felt something in the room, an invisible presence, something approaching, something that was there, watching them. The air was colder now. What had been a stupor had turned into a shiver, a chill that did not come from outside, but from inside the house, which seemed to extend like an invisible net around them. As James walked away to explore the other room, Lily stopped. She felt her eyes on her, as if she was no longer alone. She looked at the walls, the cracks, the broken doors, but what made her sweat cold were not the conditions of the place. It was the feeling that something was watching her from the moment she stepped in that house. And then, without warning, she heard a whisper. It was not the sound of the wind, nor the squeaking boards. It was something lighter, something more personal. "Lily, the sound was soft, almost like a breeze, but it was impossible to ignore." She turned abruptly, looking into the dark hall where James was now talking to something she couldn't see. She felt her breath accelerate, and before she could move toward her brother, heard a laugh. A child's laugh, low and distant, but the feeling that she was being watched, that she was following her, grew even more. "James, I heard," she began to say, but his voice cut off hers. "I'm tired of this story, Lily. There's nothing here. Okay? Just the wind, just the house." He sounded frustrated, but at the same time nervous, as if he was trying to convince himself more than her. "Come on, what are you seeing?" Lily hesitated. She didn't know what to answer, nor how to explain what she felt. The laughter continued, but now closer, clearer. She felt her hair on the back of her neck shudder. A cold sensation ran through her spine, and shadows seemed to stretch more and more around her. The whisper continued, not from one specific place, but from all directions. "Lily, help us." Lily looked around, her eyes tracking the corners of the room. The air was heavy, dense, as if the house was beginning to react to her presence. The heat of his body seemed to dissipate as the temperature dropped. The laugh, now higher, exploded in space, as if the walls were laughing along with it. She took a step back, but the movement did not seem to be hers, as if someone was pushing her into the abyss. "James? Please, are you not listening?" Lily begged, her voice now sharper, more desperate. She was feeling a growing pain in her head, as if something was pressing on her mind, forcing her to see more than she wanted. Something old, something that was there long before them. But James didn't seem to hear her. He was farther away now, playing an old wooden toy abandoned in the corner. "Nothing here, nothing here," he murmured to himself as his eyes fixated on the toy, as if he was hypnotized. Then suddenly the door behind him slammed hard, as if it had been pushed by an invisible force. Lily screamed, the sound coming out of her throat unintentionally. She ran to her brother, grabbing his arm. "James, we need to get out of here. Now!" But James seemed still. His eyes were empty, lost, as if in a trance. He did not seem to see Lily, nor hear the sound of her voice. The broken toys around them began to move on their own, crawling across the floor with a metallic sound. The walls seemed to expand and contract, as if the house was alive, breathing at a rapid pace. Lily pulled hard, but could not move her brother. He was paralyzed. Then, in the corner of the room, she saw something that made her freeze. A shadow, small but growing, moving erratically. The figure was a child, but it didn't look human. His eyes, dark as abysses, were fixed on her, watching with an intensity that made his heart almost stop. The figure's body was distorted, as if pulled from a nightmare, and she could see the shadow slowly approaching. "James, James, look!" She screamed once more, but her brother wouldn't move. The child, or whatever it was now a few steps away from him. His feet did not touch the ground, as if he were floating, moving without making the slightest sound. The laughter of other children began to echo, surrounding the house, and Lily's fear exploded inside her chest. She needed to go out, but the door was locked, and shadows were taking over the space. The house was coming alive, and there was no way out. Lily felt the cold air as the child's shadow approached, and her body froze with fear. His eyes fixed themselves on the dark eyes of the figure, which seemed to penetrate his soul, as if they knew all his deepest fears. Each child's laughter echoed stronger, and the feeling of suffocation grew. She could not move, could not scream. Her throat was dry, and the feeling of being watched by hundreds of eyes seemed to invade her mind. "James?" His voice came out in a whisper, hoarse and desperate. She looked at her brother, still motionless, her eyes fixed on the old toy. His trance was deeper than ever, and the house seemed to absorb any trace of rationality that was still left in him. Lily didn't know what to do. His mind was confused, but one thing was clear. Something very dark had been awakened there, something that was waiting for his arrival. She swallowed dry, forcing her feet to move, but before she could step out the door, a sound, low and unmistakable, cut through the silence of the house. A snap, like the sound of bones breaking, followed by a whisper, almost imperceptible. "They never come out." The voice seemed to come from all corners at once, and Lily could hardly tell whether she was really listening or if her mind was creating the words in her growing panic. The sound intensified, as if the house itself was feeding on its fear. The laughter of children increased, echoing through each corridor, now accompanied by a constant beating in the background of the house, as if something was walking, something very old. She looked at her brother, his heart beating harder. "James, please wake up. They're here. We need to get out." She pulled harder on his arm, but he was firm, stiff, like a statue, not responding to anything. The light of the lanterns flickered, and shadows seemed to grow on the walls. She took a step back, eyes popping to the figure still floating in the corner. The child, or the thing that pretended to be a child, smiled, a horrible, distorted, and malignant smile. Lily felt the ground move under her feet, as if the very foundation of the house was crumbling. With each laugh, the air seemed to become thicker, more impossible to breathe. It was when another laugh joined those that were already filling the space. A softer, more familiar laugh. Lily froze to recognize that sound. It was the laugh of a child she knew, one she hadn't seen in a long time. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to take away the memory, but the image of her little sister, small and smiling, came into her mind. "No, can't be," she whispered to herself, her heart beating in her chest with force. When he opened his eyes, the figure of the child was now floating just a few centimeters from his face. The child's skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, once black as deep pits, were now red, pulsing with an evil energy. "You can't go out," said the voice, clearer now, firmer. "You are with us now." Lily tried to step back, but something stopped her. The walls, the floor, even the air seemed to be closing in around her. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs filled with a cold, heavy and nauseating air. She felt the house was swallowing its hopes, one by one. At that moment, the old toy James was holding moved on its own, spinning as if controlled by invisible hands. A strange pressure took over the room, making the environment even heavier, oppressive. Lily looked at the toy, and for a second, James's eyes turned to her. But they weren't his eyes anymore. They were empty eyes, lifeless, as if his soul had been torn out. He was there, but not with her. "James, you need to leave. It's not you," Lily shouted, the terror in her voice breaking through the dense silence of the house. But her eyes did not recognize her anymore. The trance of her brother was deep, and he seemed speechless, immersed in something she could not understand. She looked at the children, at the laughter, at the shadows. It was no longer just a nightmare. It was a reality that she could not escape. The toys began to move towards her, with a chilling sound of wood scraping against the floor. The laughter multiplied, echoing on the walls, as if she was surrounded by an army of lost souls. The shadows seemed to grow in size, stretching and writhing, wrapped in a dense mist that covered everything, making it difficult to see what lay ahead. "You won't go out?" the voice hissed again, and before Lily could do anything, the ground under her feet opened. The shadows pulled her down, and she screamed, but her voice was muffled by the darkness. The last thing she saw was her little sister's face, smiling at her from the darkness, a pale and lifeless figure who watched her with red, empty eyes. "Welcome back," the figure muttered, as Lily fell into darkness. When Lily woke up, she didn't know where she was. Her eyes opened into total darkness, a darkness so dense it seemed to swallow the light. She felt her body weak, as if it had been dragged through a long tunnel, and her heart still beating hard, but not at the normal pace. It was beating erratically, as if being pressed by an invisible force. Tried to move, but the fatigue prevented it. His arms and legs were heavy, as if they had been stuck in something thick and viscous. She tried to speak, but her voice seemed to have been torn out. There was no sound, only absolute emptiness. Lily's mind was in tatters, but one thing was clear. She was no longer in the house. Or rather, the house was no longer what it seemed to be. The structure in which it was found seemed fluid, changeable, like a nightmare in constant transformation. The air was immersed in an icy mist, and a smell of wet earth and rot hovered in the environment. She felt the presence of something old and distant, watching her. It was then that a familiar image invaded her mind. The face of her little sister smiling. But it was not the innocent smile she remembered. It was a grim smile, vague and devoid of any trace of life. Her image was immersed in total darkness, and the laughter coming from her lips sounded more like an echo of suffering than an expression of joy. Lily rose slowly, feeling an overwhelming pressure against her chest, as if being pushed back into a reality she no longer understood. She tried to shout, but there was no sound. The house, or whatever it was with her, in her mind, in her soul. As he took a few steps, he realized that the darkness around him was not empty. The walls, if they were walls, were covered with something sticky, as if they were alive. From time to time, she could hear the whispers of other voices, muffled and distorted, mingling with childish laughter. These voices were like a distant melody, lost in time, and seemed to call for it. "You can't leave," the voice resounded in her mind once more. She recognized her, but didn't know where. It was as if it were coming from inside his own head. With a superhuman effort, Lily forced her feet to move forward, her trembling hands touching the walls that moved slowly, as if they had lives of their own. The environment around him seemed to distort, creating corridors that opened and closed with an almost hypnotic speed. Every step she took her deeper, further away from any hope. It was then that she saw the door, an old door made of dark wood, which seemed to resist reality itself. Her heart popped, and she felt a wave of despair and relief at the same time. If she could reach that door, maybe she could escape. Maybe he would meet James. When he reached the door, his fingers closed on the handle, but when he turned it, the door did not open. Instead, a force pushed her back, knocking her down. She felt intense pain in her body, but her mind was more focused on understanding what was happening around her. The house was feeding on her, and she knew that what she was trying to escape from was not just the physical place, but something much deeper. The children's laughter returned, higher, more unbearable. You will not leave. You do not belong here. No one belongs here, the voices said, in a cruel, almost amusing tone. It was as if they were feeding on their fear, their pain. Lily didn't know how long it had been, but she felt their presence, the children that were disappearing, as if they were around her. Their shadows danced on the walls, their eyes shining with pure malice. They were waiting for something, waiting for it. Whatever it was, Lily knew the real trap was in her mind. She needed to get out of that nightmare. She needed to wake up. It was when she heard James's voice, low and tenuous. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Lily," he said, his tone weak, as if it was stuck somewhere far away. She turned, looking desperately in all directions, but there was no one there. The sound of her voice seemed to be coming from inside her head. "James, where are you?" she screamed, but again there was no sound. She didn't know if he was really there or if it was just another manifestation of her own broken mind. But at that moment, all she wanted was to find her brother. The shadows began to move faster, as if reacting to their growing anxiety. They were coming closer, and the space around them seemed to compress. The door in front of her finally opened itself, but what she saw beyond it was more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. She looked into the void, into the infinite darkness that stretched beyond the door, and knew somehow that she would not be able to escape this time. She was inside something much bigger than I imagined. She was inside something that possessed her, and she would never be the same. And then, before she could take a step, the darkness swallowed her. When Lily woke up again, the darkness was no longer around her, but what surrounded her was a stillness so deep that it seemed suffocating. Her eyes, slowly adjusting to the gloom, revealed a different environment. She was back in the house, or maybe it was a version of her. The air was heavy, loaded with the smell of mold and decay, but something was different. She was no longer alone. She felt a presence, something that watched her, something that followed her every move. She tried to get up, but her feet were frozen in place, as if the house had roots inside of her. His mind, stunned by the horrors he had experienced, tried to process what was happening. The laughter, distant and uncomfortable, began to echo once again. And then, a soft whisper cut through the silence, as if it were a breath that formed into words. "Welcome back, Lily." She froze. The voice was not James's. It was softer, more cruel, and it came from all corners, not from one person, but from several. Children, the lost souls, those who have been gone for so long and those who had been consumed by the house. Lily stood up with an effort, but her feet did not touch the ground in the same way. It seemed to float, as if it was no longer in tune with the physical world. Time seemed not to exist there. She crossed the corridors, her body moving mechanically, her mind wrapped in mist. Every step she took led her to a place that she did not recognize, but at the same time felt familiar. At each turn, the walls seemed to close more, the ceiling seemed to collapse, and the laughter became more intense, closer, echoing in his ears, as if the house was alive, and it was being swallowed by it. It was then that she saw the room where everything had begun. She entered without knowing how she had gotten there. In the center of the room, an old rocking chair moved on its own, gently swinging from side to side. The moonlight illuminated the scene with a pale glow, revealing the dusty floor and walls, still stained with marks of the past. There, in the chair, was a figure. She seemed to be waiting for Lily, a child, a girl with big, dark eyes and an empty expression, empty of life. She looked directly at Lily, and for the first time the house was silent. The air stopped moving. Time seemed to have frozen. You finally arrived," the child said, his voice thin and cold. "They are waiting." Lily tried to get closer, but her legs seemed to weigh tons. She was trapped in that place, in the same prison where everyone else had been. And I knew there was no escape. Not for her. The child stood up from the chair. His steps were soft, as if they did not touch the ground. She reached out to Lily, but her eyes were empty, the eyes of a lost soul. "You are now one of us," the voice whispered, and the words seemed to enter Lily's mind, invading her thought, filling her with the horror of the truth. "The house will never let you go. No one will ever leave." And then, like a wave, the room was filled with shadowy figures, the children who disappeared, now transformed into specters dancing around Lily. Their faces were disfigured by pain, their hands extended, touching her soul, pulling it into eternal darkness. The children's laughter increased, but now it was not just laughter. It was the sound of souls that had been consumed, souls that never found rest. The sound filled every piece of her mind, making her feel small, helpless, like a shadow lost in the shadows. And then something else happened. In the midst of laughter and whispers, James' vision appeared, but not in the way she imagined. His eyes were empty, his lips half open but no speech. He was there, but it wasn't him anymore. He was stuck like her, stuck in the house, stuck to those who lived there. Lily looked at him, and in the depths of her eyes she saw the same despair that she felt. "I can't go out," he muttered, his voice broken, lifeless. And Lily knew that was the truth. There was no way out. She had become part of that, part of the house, of what consumed it and swallowed it little by little. She felt her strength waning. There was no more fighting, no more screaming. The children's laughter now intertwined with their own silent cry. She was lost. They were all lost, forever. And the house at the end of the trail, once only a place of legends, was now his home. The home of all those who, like her, had been swallowed by darkness. And the cycle would repeat itself as always, because in the end, the house was never empty. She was just waiting for another soul to devour. And this time it was Lily. The village was never the same after the night Lily and James disappeared. Over time, the residents began to forget the legends of the house at the end of the trail, as if their own fear had been consumed by the darkness that surrounded that place. But for those who dared to approach, for the few who still remembered the old story, the house remained like a silent shadow, always lurking. There were sparse reports of people who approached the trail and never returned. Some said they heard laughter, others claimed to have seen lights flashing in the window of the house, as if the children who disappeared were there, waiting. But no one dared to investigate once again. The trail that once led to the house was now covered by dense and impenetrable vegetation, as if nature itself wanted to hide what had happened there. On the morning of a rainy day, a lonely traveler passing through the village asked the old man from the square about the house at the end of the trail. The old man, with his face marked by time, looked at him with a gloomy expression and, before he could answer, a distant cry echoed in the distance. The sound came from the track direction. The traveler looked nervously at the old man, who just shook his head as if he already knew what was about to happen. "What you hear is not real," the old man said in a low voice, almost as a warning. "And what you seek has already been found." The traveler, with a shiver running through his spine, quickly moved away without looking back. But before he disappeared into the fog that was taking over the road, he heard the laughter again, a child's laugh, low and distant, coming from somewhere among the trees. And then he understood. In that house, at the end of the trail, something was still waiting, something that never left, and who dared to try to unravel the secrets of his history would never return. They would become just another echo in the night, another shadow in the darkness, waiting for the next to approach. The house was alive, as it always has been, and the trail leading to it would never be erased. Because in the end, what happened in that house was not just a story. It was a curse, destined to be perpetuated for generations. A house that waited patiently for the next lost soul. And so the cycle would continue, night after night, generation after generation. And the house at the end of the trail would never cease to be the home of what should not be seen. The small town of Hollifield, in the heart of the American countryside, lived at an almost unchanging pace. Their mornings began with the sound of tractors, and the aroma of fresh coffee escaped through the windows of wooden houses. At night, the silence of the cornfields was so deep that even the loudest ones avoided going out, preferring the comfort of their fireplaces and family stories. That week, however, something unusual hovered in the air. The conversations at the grocery store and church were lower, full of murmurs and restless looks. Walter Green, a longtime farmer and respected figure in the community, had disappeared without a trace. At first, the residents tried to rationalize. Maybe Walter had gone to visit a friend in a nearby town or went hunting without warning. But 2 days passed and no sign of him. His truck was parked next to the balcony of his house, the engine cold and the key hanging in the kitchen rack. It was Darren Miller, Walter's young apprentice, who found the first clue. On the morning of the third day, while inspecting the fields of the Green farm, Darren noticed something strange. The scarecrow, which was always fixed in the center of the field, looked different. "I thought he had an old straw hat," Darren muttered, frowning as he approached. When he got closer, he realized that the hat was not only like Walter's. It was Walter's hat, the same one he wore every day at work. It was worn and stained with sweat, but unmistakable. The most disturbing detail, however, was the fact that the scarecrow's eye buttons seemed to have been replaced by small circles of dark red cloth, as if they were stained with blood. The news soon spread through the city, and a search was organized. Men with lanterns and dogs searched the fields, but found nothing but trails that disappeared between the rows of corn. The ranks seemed to close behind them, as if the field wanted to keep their secrets. That night, the villagers returned restless to their homes. Darren, haunted by the sight of Walter's hat, could not sleep. Something in the silence of the cornfields seemed more dense, almost suffocating. And then, around midnight, Walter's wife, Margaret Green, heard something that made her cold to the bone. The sound of footsteps being dragged down the porch. She ran to the door, hoping to see her husband, but found only Walter's hat, carefully placed on the steps. Margaret closed the door with a snap and locked the cracks, heart pounding. At the bottom of the cornfield, something seemed to move, like a tall shadow that swayed in the wind. But the wind was still that night. The whole town woke up the next day knowing one thing. Something very wrong was happening in Holyfield. After the disappearance of Walter, the routine of Holyfield changed. The residents began to avoid the fields after sunset, and even the children, always curious, kept their distance from the fields. Walter's hat, found by his wife, was taken to Sheriff Harold Parker, but he didn't know what to do with it. "There are no clues, just a strange feeling," he admitted to the search party. In the following days, the farm scarecrows began to attract attention. Many residents reported that their positions were different, as if they had been moved. Some appeared closer to the houses, while others arose in fields where there were never before scarecrows. At the Grayson farm, for example, the scarecrow that always stood in the entrance of the field appeared in the middle of the corn rows, with his arms raised, as if he was greeting someone. The family tried to ignore it, thinking that the wind could be responsible. But the next morning he was again in a different place. What was even more strange was the quality of the crops. The farms where the scarecrows moved had an abnormal growth. The corn was taller, greener, and seemed to almost shine in the sunlight. It was a disturbing contrast to the other fields, which suffered from prolonged drought. In the city bar, stories began to circulate, always whispered, They say that Walter Scarecrow does not stay in the same place at night. On my farm, the buttons of my scarecrow were wet. They looked like tears. I saw a scarecrow in the Reed family field. They don't even plant corn anymore. In the midst of this chaos, Sam Carter, a young farmer, began to be bothered by the climate of fear. He was always skeptical, did not believe in superstitions or ancient legends. When the neighbors began to suggest that the scarecrows were alive or possessed, he laughed and called it paranoia. If the scarecrows are walking, maybe they're just kids playing tricks. I will find out what is happening, he declared, already tired of the stories. That same night, Sam decided to patrol his own field, determined to prove that everything was just imagination. He waited for the sun to set and, armed with a lantern and an old rifle, went towards the scarecrow that was on the edge of the cornfield. The light of the lantern revealed the old and tattered doll, stuck to a stake, with its buttons sewn in a crude way and a faded smile painted on the cloth of his face. Sam laughed softly. "You see, you're not going anywhere, buddy." But as he turned his back to return home, he heard a dry sound behind him, something like the scratch of straw against wood. He froze, his hands squeezing the rifle hard. When he turned around, the scarecrow was exactly where he left it. But something looked different. The buttons that served as eyes looked deeper, like dark holes staring at him. Sam shook his head and took a deep breath. It's just my mind playing tricks. But then, deep in the cornfield, he saw another scarecrow, in a place where he had never put any. He didn't know where it had come from, but he knew one thing. That field was not empty the night before. The tension at Hollowfield only increased. The mystery of the scarecrows was more disturbing every day, and even those who said they did not believe began to close their doors before nightfall. Something was changing in the fields, something no one could explain, and the scarecrows seemed to know it. The rumors about the scarecrows spread like wildfire in Hollowfield. No one dared to speak openly, but the worried expressions of the residents made it clear that something was wrong. The local church, which was usually empty during the week, began to receive faithful every night, praying to keep evil from the fields. Despite this, Sam Carter still refused to believe. For him, it was all just collective hysteria. But what he saw in the cornfield still tormented him. The second scarecrow he had seen seemed more real to each memory, and the feeling that he was being watched did not leave him since then. In search of answers, Sam decided to visit Elias Brown, the oldest man in Hollowfield. At 87, Elias was a kind of guardian of the city's stories, known for his detailed memoirs and the scary tales he told children during the autumn festivals. "I need you to tell me about the scarecrows," Sam said as he entered the little log cabin where Elias lived. The old man looked at him with narrow eyes, adjusting his glasses to the weather-marked face. "Why do you want to know this now, boy? Some secrets are better buried." Sam, impatient, insisted. "Something is happening in the fields, Elijah. Scarecrows are appearing where they shouldn't, and people are disappearing. I saw something strange in my cornfield." As if they moved, Elias' gaze turned dark, and he gestured to Sam to sit. After a long silence, he began to speak, his voice low and heavy. "You're not the first to notice that, boy. Those fields have stories older than Hollowfield. Long before our people came here, these lands were considered cursed by the natives. They said that the harvest spirits lived here, hungry, waiting for tributes." Sam raised his eyebrows. "Tributes? What kind of tribute?" Elijah continued. "When the first settlers arrived, the land was fertile, but not for free. In the early years, crops failed and hunger took over. Desperate, they began to sacrifice animals. But it was not enough. Then began to disappear outsiders, people that no one would miss. The scarecrows were made to be guardians of these sacrifices, to keep the spirits satisfied. And for a while it worked. Sam shook his head. Disbeliever. You expect me to believe that scarecrows are... what? Guardians of ghosts? Elijah shrugged, his face unexpressive. Sam felt a chill run through his spine. Still, he tried to laugh at the story. All right, Elijah, let's say that's true. What happened next? Why did people stop? The old man paused, watching Sam with piercing eyes. They didn't stop. They just got better at hiding. Someone always pays the price, Sam. Always. Before leaving, Elias held Sam's arm with a strength surprising for his age. Beware what you provoke, boy. The spirits don't forget. And from what I hear, it seems they are hungry again. Sam returned home with his head full of doubts. The story seemed absurd, but the facts around him were hard to ignore. He began to observe the city's scarecrows more closely, and one thing became evident. They were more numerous than ever. That night, as Sam was trying to sleep, he heard something outside, a low sound like straw crawling on the floor. He remained motionless, holding his breath until the sound disappeared. For the first time, he began to wonder if Elijah was right. Perhaps the spirits of the fields were really waking up, and Hollifield was not prepared to face them. The nights at Hollifield became increasingly disturbing. The wind that once gently rocked the cornfields now sounded like murmur. People avoided leaving their homes after sunset, but even so, the disappearance of another resident shook the city. Darren Miller, the young apprentice of Walter Green, mysteriously disappeared after claiming to investigate the scarecrows from Walter's farm. The next day, his friends found only a pair of boots in the entrance to the cornfield, partially covered with dirt. Sam Carter, still haunted by the words of Elias Brown, could not ignore the signs. He knew that something ancient and dangerous was awakening, but needed to understand more. Decided, again went to seek Elijah. This time, Elias did not receive him with stories, but with something more concrete. An old leather-bound notebook spent by the time. This notebook was written by my grandfather, Elias explained, handing the object to Sam. He was part of a small group who knew the truth about these fields. They kept the ritual alive. But when he died, no one else had the courage to continue. Sam opened the notebook and saw pages full of notes in a trembling handwriting. Between reports of abundant harvests and mysterious disappearances, a series of instructions caught his attention. It was what seemed to be a ritual of appeasement. Elijah continued, they said that, in each generation, a sacrifice had to be made. It was not always a person. Sometimes, it was enough something that the spirits valued. Blood, bones, an offer sincere. But whatever it was, it had to be left in the heart of the field, where the soil is darker and their presence stronger. Sam felt his stomach wrap when reading the instructions. The ritual involved building a new scarecrow, using personal items from the sacrifice, and burying it in the ground next to a container of fresh blood. That's crazy, he muttered, closing the notebook. It may be, said Elijah with a heavy look, but you are seeing what happens when no one pays the price. Spirits take what they want. Desperate for answers, Sam decided to investigate Walter Green's farm at night, despite growing fear. He knew that the ritual could be the only way to stop more people from disappearing. That night, armed with a lantern and Elias' notebook, Sam walked to Walter's farm. The full moon illuminated the fields, but the darkness among the corn rows seemed even more oppressive. When it reached the scarecrow, the sight was enough to almost make him give up. The scarecrow was different. His skin of cloth was torn, and the stakes that formed the arms seemed longer, almost human. Walter's hat, which before seemed a disturbing coincidence, now appeared fused to the figure. Sam took a deep breath and began to follow the ritual instructions. He collected some personal items of Walter found on the balcony of the house. A scarf, a rusty keychain, and an old ring. Buried them in the ground near the scarecrow and proceeded to the next stage. Find the heart of the field. As he walked through the corn rows, he felt an overwhelming presence, as if being watched by hundreds of invisible eyes. The sound of the straw scratching seemed to come from all sides. Something was following him. Finally, he found the place indicated in the notebook. an area where the soil was darker, almost black, and the corn stalks seemed twisted. There he completed the ritual, pouring out the blood vessel he had prepared reluctantly. As soon as it was over, the air became heavy, and silence fell like a suffocating blanket. It was when he heard a guttural sound, like a distant moan coming from the bottom of the cornfield. Sam backed away, his lantern flickering in his hand. Suddenly something emerged from the corn rows. It was not human. The figure seemed made of straw, but moved in a fluid way, with eyes that shone like embers. Sam froze, unable to move. The figure stopped a few meters from him, tilting his head in an almost curious way. Then, without warning, disappeared in the middle of the ranks, leaving only the muffled sound of footsteps disappearing into the distance. Sam came home running, heart beating out of control. He didn't know if the ritual had worked, but he was sure of one thing. Something had been awakened, and the city of Hollifield would never be the same. In the days that followed, Hollifield entered a state of almost palpable tension. The city looked different, as if an invisible shadow hovered over every house and every field. Despite his attempt to appease the spirits, Sam Carter could not escape the feeling that something was still deeply wrong. The disappearances stopped, but a new restlessness took hold of the residents. Scarecrows began to appear in fields where they had never been before, and strangely each of them seemed a little more human. Sam watched everything from his balcony at night, unable to remove the memory of the straw figure he turned during the ritual. He tried to ignore, rationalize, but something in the back of his mind said that the scarecrows were inextricably linked to those events. One afternoon while working in the field, Sam found something that made his blood cold. A torn piece of cloth stuck in one of the scarecrow's stakes. It was human tissue, like part of a shirt, and looked stained with dried blood. He began to dig around the base of the scarecrow, the heart pounding. After a few minutes, he found something buried there. A piece of bone, long and thin, that seemed to have belonged to a human leg. Sam dropped the tool, fingers shaking, and backed back. The sight was enough to make him run to Elijah once more. Elijah, hearing the story, remained silent for long seconds before mumbling, "I warned you, boy. When the spirits are not satisfied, they take the bodies of whomever crosses their path. The scarecrows are not only guardians, they are prisoners. And now that they have been awakened, God knows what they will do." Sam, overcome with panic, insisted, "How can we stop them? There must be a way to end this." Elijah looked at him with tired eyes. "The only way to appease them is to complete the sacrifice. The true one, human blood. It is that, or they will continue to take what they desire, until the whole earth is theirs." Sam came home confused and desperate. The idea of sacrificing someone was abominable, but what Elijah said made sense, however terrible it was. He began to notice more disturbing details. The scarecrows seemed to be shifting places, appearing in parts of the field where they had not been before. That night he dreamed of the field. In the dream, the scarecrows were alive, watching him with glowing eyes of fire. They murmured in husky and distorted voices, their words echoing in Sam's mind. The harvest must be completed. Upon waking up, bathed in cold sweat, he realized that he could not ignore it any longer. Sam had to make a decision: protect Hollifield at all costs, or risk everything by challenging the spirits. He began to watch the villagers, looking for someone who could be the sacrifice. The idea tormented him, but in his despair he became convinced that he would save more lives this way. However, deep down, Sam knew that the price of the decision would be more than blood. As he pondered, the city itself began to change. Houses were empty, residents fleeing in silence. Those who remained seemed increasingly apathetic, as if their own life was being drained from them. That night, looking out the window, Sam saw something that paralyzed him. A scarecrow stood at the entrance of his property. It was the same one he had tried to appease in the ritual, but now it seemed to be waiting for him. Sam closed his eyes, trying to ignore it, but knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable. He needed to act, or lose everything. That morning, Sam put on his jacket and left home with the determination of someone who knew there was no choice. Elijah's notebook was under his arm, and in his hand an axe he used for farm work. The scarecrow was still standing at the entrance of his property, immobile, but its presence was suffocating, as if the object was watching him. Sam stared at him for a few moments before heading into the heart of the cornfield. Arriving at the center of the field, where he had completed the ritual days before, Sam found something that made him hesitate. The ground, once black, now pulsated slightly as if it were alive. The corn rows around were twisted, forming a kind of natural circle that looked like an arena. And then they began to appear, scarecrows. One by one, they emerged from the shadows between the ranks, surrounding Sam. They moved erratically, almost staggeringly, but there was a clear intention. They wanted him to finish what he had begun. In the middle of that circle, a human figure was kneeling. It was Walter Green. He was alive, but barely moved, his head hanging to the side, his eyes fixed on the ground. His skin looked pale, almost translucent, and a thin layer of dust covered him as if he was already partially buried. Sam fell to his knees, feeling the weight of the choice crushing him. He knew what he had to do, but his heart was screaming against it. While he held the axe, he remembered Elijah's words. The sacrifice must be voluntary or chosen by the one who awakened them. Otherwise, the price will be even higher. With trembling hands, Sam walked to Walter, who raised his head slowly. His eyes were empty, but there was a silent understanding. Walter did not speak, but he seemed to accept his fate. Sam raised the axe, the weight of the decision making each second more unbearable. Before he could hesitate again, he closed his eyes and lowered the blade. The silence that followed was absolute. The scarecrows stopped moving. The wind ceased, and the field seemed to hold its breath. Walter's body fell to the ground, and the soil immediately began to absorb it, as if he were hungry. The circle of scarecrows around disappeared, dissolving in the shadows of the corn field. The air seemed less heavy, but the emptiness that settled inside of Sam was even more suffocating. When the sun rose, Sam returned home exhausted and broken. He saw no more scarecrows that morning, nor heard rumors of further disappearances. But looking at Walter's farm, he realized that the scarecrow standing in his driveway had disappeared. The following days brought a disturbing calm to Hollowfield. The residents who had fled began to return, but something in the city would never be the same. Walter's cornfield was abandoned, the soil considered cursed. Sam, in turn, was never the same. He stopped attending community meetings, avoided neighbors, and started living reclusive. When Elijah visited him for the last time, he found a pale and silent man haunted by something he would never confess. Before leaving, Elijah left a last warning. You may have appeased the spirits this time, but they never rest for long. One day, Hollowfield will have to pay the price again. Years later, travelers passing through Hollowfield reported seeing something peculiar in the abandoned fields. In the middle of the corn, they say, there is a lone scarecrow that does not move with the wind. Some swear he looks like Walter Green, while others claim to hear whispers as they pass by. And so the name of Hollowfield became a legend, a cautionary tale about the insatiable hunger of the fields and the cost of waking up what should remain asleep. The small town of West Hollow had little to offer, except its quiet streets, old houses, and a tranquility that seemed to be in constant danger of being broken. Tucked away between hills and a thick forest, West Hollow had a history few dared recall. A story whispered by mouth, a legend that for many was just another old fable, but for others it was a warning to be respected. There is a well, right in the middle of the forest, said Mrs. Morrison, the old woman who lived in the house on top of the hill, where the wind seemed ever stronger, a well that no one should approach. They say it is cursed. She spoke with a distant look, as if she was remembering something she wished to forget. In the evening he calls, whispers names. People who go into the forest at night are never seen again. Never again. The young people of the city, tired of the monotony of everyday life, listened to these reports with a certain skepticism. Old legend, they said, laughing among themselves. What's so scary about a well? However, there was something in every story told about him that made the air heavier. as if the wind itself were afraid to touch that place. Among the curious were 4 friends. Lucas, the bravest of the group, always with a smile on his face and a ready joke. Carla, who said she was skeptical and challenged any kind of superstition. John, the quieter but always attentive one, who began to be interested in stories that no one else wanted to hear. And Sarah, the sensitive one, who felt uncomfortable when the matter fell on the forest. One autumn afternoon, while the friends were gathering in the main square, the legend's theme came back to the surface. "What if we went to the well?" said Lucas with a nervous laugh. "I bet it's just another story to scare us." "I don't think we should," said Sarah, a shiver creeping up the spine. "They say that whoever goes there at night is gone. That the voices, the whispers are real." John, who had been silent until then, looked at others with a piercing look. Perhaps it is time to find out the truth. The challenge was launched. The next night would be the longest of their lives. And, as always with these kinds of stories, no one wanted to admit fear, but everyone felt it. They were about to go into the forest. And with that, the legend would become much more than a story. It would be an experience. However, there was a touch of hesitation in the air, as if something was watching his steps, waiting patiently. Something that should have remained buried in the past. Night fell slowly over West Hollow, and the shadows swallowed the last lights of the sunset. At Lucas's house, the group gathered to make final preparations before the expedition. The mood was heavy, as if the universe itself was silent, waiting for something. Even those who had doubted the stories began to feel the weight of the decision they made. Carla, with her challenging look, was the first to speak. "So let's go. There is nothing there but an old well. If it's just another legend, as they say, we go back and laugh about it the next day." She tried to look confident, but even she could feel the tension in the air. Sarah, on the other hand, was visibly nervous. I don't know if it's a good idea," she said, fiddling with the straps of her backpack, trying to look away. What if it's true? What if the legend is not just a story?" John said nothing. He stood by the window, looking out into the darkness that was gathering outside. Something seemed to call him into that forest. Something in the air seemed to have changed, making the environment denser, heavier. When Luke looked at him, waiting for an answer, John just nodded. The adventure was set. They would go. Lucas smiled, trying to soften the tense mood. "All right, guys, let's have some fun. Tomorrow, everyone will be telling stories about what we saw. And no, I warn." He paused, looking at others. "What do you say? Let's go." The group reluctantly agreed, gathered lanterns, backpacks, and what they needed most, although the feeling that they were about to enter something beyond their strength was growing. They knew there was something at stake, something deeper than a simple walk in the forest. Before they left, Sarah, with a worried look, said, "Let's promise that if we find something strange, we will leave immediately. No questions, no discussion. Let's just go. Okay?" Lucas laughed and slapped Sarah on the shoulder, trying to ease her anxiety. Sure. If something strange comes up, we run. But I don't think it will happen." They left the house, crossed the dark streets, and started walking towards the forest. The sky was clear, but the darkness seemed to swallow the path ahead, as if the forest were a place where time and space lost all meaning. The sounds of the city were left behind, replaced by the muffled sound of their own steps. "This is more for us to prove ourselves, isn't it?" asked Carla, breaking the silence. "I don't believe that someone really disappeared here. I have heard stories," John replied, looking sideways, "of people who walked around at night and never came back." "Stories," Luke repeated, not believing. "It's just another scary story from a small town." But the forest seemed to respond to his skepticism. The wind began to blow stronger, and the sound of the dry leaves moving was the only sound that accompanied the friends as they advanced deeper into the darkness. With each step, the feeling of discomfort increased. The trees, tall and dense, seemed to create a cloak of darkness above them, obscuring the stars. When they were about half an hour walk from the city, they started to hear the distant sound of something that seemed to whisper. "We are already close," said Lucas, the enthusiasm from before beginning to dissipate in his voice. "Let's continue." Carla, who was already beginning to feel uncomfortable, could no longer ignore the cold that was taking over her skin. "I don't like it. I really don't like it." But nobody stopped. They were close, and the forest, which before seemed only a place of mystery, now seemed to have become a place where time had stopped. With each step, the world around them seemed to close more until they finally arrived. There he was, the well, surrounded by old trees and covered with a layer of moss. Something in that place seemed wrong, as if the well was more than just a physical object. It was as if he was waiting for them, as if he had felt their arrival from the moment they stepped into the forest. Luke stepped forward with a defiant smile. "Here we are, the great cursed well." But as he approached, silence fell. The wind stopped, the trees were quiet, and then they heard the first whispers. Voices, faintly, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. "Help! Help us!" And for the first time, everyone felt truly alone. The atmosphere around the well looked different now. The air was heavy, dense, as if an invisible pressure were crushing it. Silence, which was a soothing backdrop before, had become oppressive. The voices, still soft, began to intensify, echoing through the trees, as if the wind itself carried them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she looked at the others. His hand trembled slightly over the lantern, illuminating only a small piece of the darkness around him. The sound of voices, almost imperceptible at first, now seemed to come from all directions. She looked at the others, but they were as paralyzed as she was. "Yes, I heard," said Carla, in her lowest voice, trying to hide the fear that was beginning to show. "It's just the winds, folks. Can't be anything." But there was something in the tone of the words that Carla could not ignore. Something in her own ears that was beyond the wind. It was as if the voices were asking for help, or perhaps something even darker. John didn't talk. He was standing still, as if trying to hear something else. He knew it wasn't just the wind. He felt a presence, a force that was not welcome. Something watched him from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Lucas, the boldest of the group, was the first to break the silence. "Enough talk. We are here, and we will not leave without finding out what this is." With a forced smile, he took another step towards the well, his focus clearly fixed on the dark background where the voices seemed to originate. As he approached, the surrounding trees seemed to lean back, moving away from him as if they were making room for something. The sound of the dried leaves under his feet, normally simple and natural, now sounded strangely muffled, as if the ground itself was being devoured by darkness. "Luke, wait!" Sarah shouted, her concern growing in her voice. She tried to go after him, but something stopped her. A feeling of something watching her, a pressure on her back. She looked at the others, who were equally paralyzed, with her eyes fixed on the figure of Luke. He paused for a moment, turning to his friends. "What's it? Don't tell me you're afraid now," he mocked, but his gaze was distant. His eyes were fixed on the well, as if something was calling him from inside. And it was at this moment that the earth around the well began to shake slightly, as if an invisible force were awakening. The wind came back, stronger than ever, but now it seemed to be swirling around them in circles, as if trying to drive them away. The trees, once motionless, began to creak, their leaves swaying violently, as if a storm was about to arrive. "Lucas, let's go. Now!" Carla cried, her voice now breaking the threatening silence that had formed. But Luke did not hear. He was very close now, his body almost at the edge of the well. The whispers, now sharper, seemed to murmur his name. "Luke, come. Come to us." It was impossible to understand where those voices came from, but there was no doubt that they were calling him. The tension was building up, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for what came next. With a gesture, Luke finally knelt at the edge of the well, reaching out to the deep and dark bottom. His eyes were fixed on the darkness below, as if he was seeing something that others could not. "I'll just take a look," he said, the voice without conviction, but the decision was made. Just a look, Before the others could protest, something happened. The earth around the well was shaking violently, causing the friends to instinctively retreat. A scream tore the air, a guttural sound, primitive, coming from the bottom of the well, as if something was trying to get out of there. The ground shook hard, causing the friends to fall on their knees, as a cold and suffocating air wave enveloped them. Sarah tried to scream, but his voice did not come out. Carla, with her eyes wide open, looked at Lucas, but he was no longer there. The well was empty. There was no trace of Luke. The silence that followed was muffled by the feeling of something watching them, something feeding on their fears, waiting for them to come down too, to find whatever it had released. "Come on, we need to get out of here." John finally managed to talk, grabbing Sarah's arm tightly, pulling her back. But before they could move, the sound of voices intensified, filling the air with a sense of impending catastrophe. "Help us! Help us!" The voices whispered, now more desperate. It was too late to return. The forest had marked them, and something much older than the city itself now watched them, waiting. The wind seemed to be stronger with every step, as if the forest was closing around them, trapping them in their invisible prison. Sarah, still stunned by the sight of the void where Lucas had been, looked at others with a look of growing panic. John, who seemed calmer but with wide eyes, pulled her closer to him. "We need to get out of here," he said in a husky voice, but there was a strange hesitation in his speech, as if, deep down, he knew it would not be so simple. Carla was a few steps away, her expression a mixture of anger and despair. "Where did he go, John? Where is Lucas?" His voice trembled, but there was something deeper in his fury, as if the fear was being masked by an irrational urge to continue the search, even knowing that there was no more time to seek. But John did not answer. He did not know. The pit, the emptiness, the darkness that had swallowed Luke, everything seemed to unite in something more sinister, deeper than any legend they had heard. They were on the verge of something greater than they could comprehend, something that words could not define. As they tried to get away from the well, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The trees, with their intertwined roots, began to move slowly, bending as if they were regrouping for a macabre dance. The leaves, which once fell softly, now seemed to move by themselves, crawling over the ground like invisible spectrum's hands. "You see that?" Sarah whispered, pointing to the trees around them. Her fingers were cold but not cold. It was the kind of ice cream that came from pure anxiety. Carla looked around, her eyes passing through the twisted trees, through the increasingly dense darkness. And then, without saying a word, she began to walk back toward the well. "I won't leave him behind," she said, more to herself than to others. "The fault is mine. I pushed him into it." "Carla, no!" Sarah shouted, running after her. But Carla's voice was lost in the rising sound of the forest, the whispering of the voices calling her, as if the well itself were extending its invisible claws to her. John turned to Sarah. "We have to go after her. We don't have a choice." He wasn't sure what he was talking about, but his mind was already elsewhere. They knew what would happen if they stayed there, at the mercy of that growing darkness. But they also knew that going after Carla could be the end of it. They ran, their lanterns lighting only bits of the forest, the trees stretching out like ghostly figures, the invisible faces watching them with an empty gaze. As they approached the well, the feeling of oppression increased, and the air seemed dense, suffocating, as if something was rising to the surface, something that should not be released. Carla was there, standing at the edge of the well, staring at the black background. The voices now were more intense, and the words intertwined in a single desperate plea. "Help us! Please help us! Carla!" "No!" Sarah shouted, running to her. But before he could reach it, a shadow formed behind her, coming out of the pit like a dark spot in the light of the lantern. The well, which before seemed only an inert and forgotten object, was now alive. He exhaled a palpable energy, a force that sucked reality around him, distorting time and space. The surrounding trees began to creak violently, their leaves becoming like sharp knives, cutting through the air with a high-pitched sound. And then, as if obeying a silent command, the earth around the well began to open. It was not a simple crack. It was as if a door were being opened to a deep, dark, infinite abyss. "Carla!" John cried, but his voice was muffled by the sound of the earth separating. The roots of the trees writhed, twisting like snakes, while the air around them became denser, wetter. "Go away! Go away now!" Carla shouted, turning to the others with hallucinated eyes as if she was no longer there. She didn't see them. She could not hear them. She was lost in the abyss of the well, her body leaning more and more towards the darkness that opened beneath it. Before they could act, a figure appeared at the bottom of the pit. It was a shadow, undefined but completely human, with dark eyes and deep as the emptiness that emanated from the well. The figure looked at Carla, and then, with a gentle movement, reached out his hand. The words that came out of his mouth were incomprehensible, like an ancestral, ancient language that was not to be heard by mortals. Carla, with an empty smile, took a step forward. "Carla, no!" Sarah tried to scream, but the sound of her voice seemed to be swallowed up by the growing silence, as if the well itself was absorbing the reality around them. And then, with a last sigh, Carla disappeared into the darkness of the well, her figure being pulled inward, as if being devoured by something older than time, older than the earth itself. The silence that followed was absolute. There was no more wind, no sound of leaves, no sound of trees. Only the sound of their accelerated breaths, and the echo of the voices that continued, soft, coming from within the well. "Help us! Help us!" But now no one else was there to help. The well was now silent. The emptiness had settled with a suffocating intensity, the cold air squeezing in his lungs, making breathing for John and Sarah increasingly difficult. They were paralyzed, unable to react, their bodies marked by the terrifying scene before them. Carla had disappeared, consumed by a force that even words could not explain. The feeling of despair was pressing on Sarah's chest, but the fear of losing herself also made her hesitate. She wanted to run. He wanted to go back to the city, away from this cursed forest, but his feet did not move. She looked at John, waiting for some sign, some action that would get them out of there. But he was still, the expression empty, the eyes lost in the darkness of the well. The vision of the bottom of the pit still burned in his mind. That shadow, that human figure who had reached out to Carla, it was as if something else had been released, something that now looked at them. Sarah felt the hair on her back of her head shudder with thought. "John, we need to get out of here. Now!" Sarah finally spoke, her voice hoarse and unstable. But John didn't answer. He seemed to hear something, or perhaps see something she couldn't. His eyes were glazed, fixed on the well. Sarah took a step towards him, touching his arm, but he did not move or react. It seemed that he was in a trance, absorbed in a vision that could not be real. The silence was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, as if someone was approaching from behind. Sarah turned quickly, the lantern lighting up the darkness, but there was no one there. The forest, in a barely perceptible movement, seemed to approach, the shadows stretching in a strange way, almost as if they were alive. "No, we're not alone here," Sarah muttered, the tension in her voice growing. John finally moved, but it was in a strange way, as if he was being pulled by something invisible. He began to walk towards the well, his slow and heavy steps as if the ground itself was sucking him. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice did not come out. She tried to run to him, but something stopped her, as if an invisible force was keeping her body in captivity. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the edge of the well, a shadow in motion. It was no longer a simple illusion. It was a concrete form, a human silhouette, but his body seemed distorted, as if the reality around him were being twisted, shaped by some evil presence. "John, no!" Sarah screamed, finally getting her move on. She ran towards him, but the well seemed to expand in front of her, as if swallowing the surrounding forest, making everything around her infinitely distant. The shadow at the edge of the pit turned slowly to her, her black eyes shining with a supernatural intensity. The voice that followed was not human, but a deep whisper, a mixture of words and sounds that cut the air. You can't escape. It's too late. It was a voice that did not seem to come from a human being, but something older, deeper, something that was beyond death, beyond time. Sarah stopped, the blood freezing in her veins. She wanted to scream, run, but her body did not respond. The fear, pure and immense, paralyzed her legs. The wind howled again, this time with even greater force, as if being channeled by something that dominated the forest. The trees bent inward, as if they were surrounding them, and the sound of whispers intensified, becoming increasingly unbearable. John, with empty eyes, was now standing at the edge of the well, staring into the darkness below. He was no longer there in a deep sense. There was no more emotion in his gaze, only an absolute emptiness. Sarah tried to approach, but something pulled her back. An invisible force stronger than anything she had ever experienced. She looked back and saw, for the first time, what was really behind them. The trees around the well began to bend, twisting as if they were made of flesh and bone. A larger, more defined figure emerged from the well. It was no longer a shadow, but something solid, with human contours, but distorted, deformed, as if nature itself had been corrupted. His eyes were two black holes, immense, reflecting an infinite darkness. It was him, the entity that had been released, the being that hid at the bottom of the pit, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The wind was rising, but now it seemed to emanate from the figure, like a storm that was rising within it. The tree roots, now like tentacles, began to crawl towards the center, wrapping Sarah and John in a suffocating embrace. Sarah didn't know if what was happening around her was real or if her mind was breaking under the weight of terror, but she knew there was no turning back. John, with a last expression of emptiness, fell forward into the abyss that now opened monstrously before him. The figure in front of him smiled, twisting even more, as the earth around the pit opened like the mouth of a thirsty monster. "Now you're one of us," the voice whispered as Sarah felt her strength fading. And the moment John disappeared into darkness, Sarah knew there was no way out. They had been consumed by the forest, consumed by what was there, waiting patiently to take everything. The wind howled, dragging dry leaves that danced frantically around the well. Sarah felt her body heavy, as if an invisible force pushed her into the earth, as if she were a ghost about to be swallowed up by something she could not see but knew existed. She struggled to breathe, but the air was thick and cold, impregnated with a nauseating essence that seemed to come directly from the bottom of the earth. The well, now open and monstrous, was the only point of reference in a scene of chaos and desolation. She tried to scream, but her voice did not come. The terror that had settled in his chest was so dense that the words seemed to dissolve before they even left. She looked around, her eyes tearing with fear, but there was no sign of John. The forest, which once seemed alive, was now immersed in a deadly silence, as if it were watching what remained of Sarah, waiting for the right moment to consume her too. The figure next to the well, now fully formed, approached slowly, its movements fluid and frighteningly graceful, as if time around it had no importance. His eyes, large and black as the darkness, fixed themselves on Sarah, and she felt a presence so oppressive that her legs trembled. It was not a human being, it was not something that could be explained, but an ancient entity with a power that defied its own understanding. "You thought you could get out of here," said the voice, now clear and imposing, as a deep echo that reverberated in Sarah's bones. She didn't know if the voice came from the figure, the pit, or somewhere inside herself. It didn't matter. The feeling was that the earth itself was talking to her, and the truth she always denied was being revealed now. Sarah tried to step back, but the ground seemed to be closing under her feet, trapping her as if the well itself was sucking all that she was. His vision began to become blurred, the air more dense. She looked again at the well and noticed something that she had failed to notice before. From the bottom of the well, something was rising, something that was not human, but rather an unformed mass, a a cluster of shadows and tentacles that stretched like roots of a poison tree. She tried to run, but her mind was so overwhelmed with fear that the body did not respond. Her heart was beating fast, like a drum in her ears, and she knew that every second that passed was 1 second less of life than she had. The feeling that the well would not let it escape was unbeatable. He had become a reflection of human nature itself, insatiable, devouring, like darkness that swallows light. It was when, with a muffled snap, the figure took a step forward, his presence now invading all space around Sarah. He was so close that she felt the pressure of darkness enveloping her like a straitjacket. She could no longer breathe, could no longer think. The emptiness took her completely. "You have been chosen," said the voice, softer now, but with a promise of eternal suffering. "Now you belong to the well." Sarah closed her eyes, no longer strong enough to resist. When she opened them again, there was nothing around her but darkness. The forest was gone. The sound of wind and whispers stopped. She was alone, but not at peace. Something had been taken from her, something that could not be returned. She felt in a place between life and death, between what is and what could have been. The well had been forgotten for a long time, but now it was immortal. And Sarah, like all others before her, was now part of its eternal echo. The well did not forget. He just waited for the next one who dared to approach. And somewhere far away, a new group of young men was approaching the forest, attracted by the same curiosity that had consumed Sarah and her friends. The cycle was about to repeat itself. The pit was waiting for more souls, more bodies, more minds to be broken. And so the legend continued.